Imagine living your entire life in one single room, raising 6 children, cooking over an open fire, sleeping side by side with animals, praying, giving birth, even dying, all in the same cramped, dirt-floored space. There were no walls, no privacy, no silence. But this wasn't rare. For millions across medieval Europe, this was normal. It wasn't poverty, it was simply life. A forgotten way of existing, where survival meant togetherness and discomfort was a daily companion. Today, we step inside that dark, smoky room to uncover the astonishing reality of how medieval families truly lived. Between the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century and the dawn of the Renaissance 1,000 years later, Europe entered an era defined not by prosperity, but by survival. This was the medieval world, a place of stark contrasts, rigid hierarchies, and unforgiving landscapes. Life was shaped by war, famine, faith, and the feudal system. For the vast majority, it unfolded entirely within the walls of a single room. Feudalism wasn't just a political structure, it was the scaffolding of everyday life. At the top stood monarchs and nobles. Beneath them, a cascade of lords, vassals, knights, and finally, at the very bottom, peasants. More than 90% of Europe's population belonged to this lowest tier. Their lives revolved around the land they didn't own but were bound to work. In exchange for protection, they gave their labor, their loyalty, and their lives. And at the heart of that life was the home. Not a castle, not a cottage, but a hut, constructed from whatever materials the land could offer: wattle and daub walls, timber frames, and thatched roofs of straw or reeds. The floor was often just packed earth. Windows, if any, were small slits, covered with oiled cloth or thin wooden shutters. Glass was a luxury far beyond their reach. Inside, there were no hallways, no bedrooms, no doors to close. Just one open space. The hearth sat at the center, the only source of heat, light, and a place to cook. Smoke from the fire had nowhere to go. Chimneys were rare before the 12th century. Most homes had a hole in the roof or none at all. The air inside was thick with soot and the scent of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and livestock. Livestock, because it was common, especially in colder regions, for families to bring animals inside for warmth and protection. Chickens clucked beneath benches, goats and pigs huddled in corners. The boundaries between domestic life and agricultural life were virtually non-existent. Furniture was sparse: a wooden table, maybe a bench, and straw-stuffed bedding rolled into a corner at night. Entire families, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, slept together on the same pallet or directly on the floor. Infants shared beds with adults, often swaddled tightly to prevent rolling accidents. There was no concept of a nursery, no room for privacy, no personal belongings beyond the bare essentials. For medieval peasants, the idea of multiple rooms was unthinkable. Walls took resources and labor. Space was for the wealthy. In manor houses or noble estates, multi-room dwellings began to appear: a main hall, a private chamber, sometimes a separate kitchen. But for the common people, separating life into compartments was not only impractical, it was culturally alien. The home was not a retreat. It was a workspace, a shelter, a place of worship, birth, illness, and death. Everything happened in that one shared space. These structures weren't built for comfort, they were built for survival. And in that, they succeeded, generation after generation. In a world without walls, families found ways to live, to endure, and to adapt. One-room home wasn't a flaw in medieval life. It was its foundation, a reflection of a society where simplicity wasn't just a necessity, but the norm. As centuries passed, these huts dotted the European countryside, anonymous, unadorned, and forgotten. But inside, they carried the full weight of medieval existence. The architecture tells the story, and the story begins in a single room in the medieval countryside. The home was more than just a shelter. It was the center of existence. And for most peasant families, that existence unfolded entirely within 4 rough walls and a single open room. The average peasant household in 12th or 13th century Europe included parents, children, and sometimes extended family, all living, eating, working, and sleeping together. In the tightest quarters, 3 generations could share the same space. In regions like rural England or northern France, the one-room dwelling measured no more than 15 to 25 square meters, about the size of a modern garage. At night, sleeping arrangements followed no fixed pattern. There was often only one bed. If a family could afford one at all, it might be little more than a wooden frame with ropes or slats, topped with a thin mattress of straw or hay. Parents and younger children often shared this bed, while older children or relatives slept on piles of rushes or cloth on the floor. Blankets were rare. Animal skins, cloaks, or heavy wool garments served the purpose, but sleep wasn't truly private. Animals often shared the space too. Pigs, chickens, or even a cow might be brought indoors at night to protect them from theft or the cold. A half-wall or raised platform sometimes separated the family from the animals, but not always. In places like Scandinavia, longhouses even had designated animal stalls built directly into the family dwelling, a practical solution for heat retention as much as for security. Furniture was sparse and multifunctional. A bench used for sitting during the day became a bed at night. A chest might store grain, but also serve as a makeshift table. Hooks on the wall held tools and clothing. Shelves, when present, were small and built directly into the frame of the house. Possessions were minimal, often passed down through generations or made by hand. At the heart of it all, both literally and symbolically, was the hearth, usually a fire pit or simple stone-lined base in the center or side of the room. The hearth provided warmth, light, and the means to cook. There was no chimney in most homes before the late medieval period. Smoke lingered, filling the air and blackening the thatched ceiling. Openings near the roofline allowed some ventilation, but eye irritation and chronic coughing were common. Consequences of daily life. Daily routines followed the rhythms of the seasons. In winter, the one room became a refuge from freezing winds and snow. In summer, it was often sweltering and infested with flies. Yet despite the discomfort, families found routine. Chores, meals, prayer, and sleep happened in rotation, each person knowing their place and role. Children learned through observation. Women spun wool or prepared food, while men repaired tools or cared for livestock, all within arm's reach of one another. There was little room for solitude. Privacy, as understood today, did not exist, but neither did the expectation of it. Life under one roof was communal, functional, and often noisy. Survival demanded cooperation, and space was a shared resource, not a personal right. This was not an accidental design. It was a deliberate reflection of the values, economy, and limitations of the time, a system built around necessity, and a way of life forged from the relentless demands of the medieval world. In the medieval world, Privacy was not just rare, it was virtually unknown. For the vast majority of Europeans living between the 9th and 15th centuries, personal space was a foreign concept. A single room housed the entire arc of human experience. Birth, death, sex, illness, and daily bodily functions unfolded within arm's reach of family members, neighbors, or animals. What we now consider intimate or private was, in medieval life, simply part of the shared routine. This was not due to ignorance or a lack of morality. It was the result of necessity, social structure, and cultural norms shaped by hardship. Survival demanded proximity. There was no room literally or figuratively for separation. Walls were expensive. Rooms meant resources, labor, and status. Only the elite could afford homes with designated spaces for sleeping, cooking, or retreat. For peasants and laborers, the single-room hut was not a choice, it was the only option. Childbirth occurred openly. Women labored in the same space where meals were cooked and children played. Female relatives, midwives, or village women attended the birth, but the event was not hidden. It wasn't uncommon for young children to witness the process. It was part of life, not something to shield from view. Death was no more private. Dying often happened at home, in the same room where life unfolded. The body would remain in place for hours or days, sometimes prepared for burial right in the home. The entire family participated in mourning, not through withdrawal, but through communal ritual washes, prayers, and the wake. Sexual activity, though more discreet, was not hidden in the modern sense. In one-room households, couples might wait until children were asleep or occupied, but complete isolation was rare. Contemporary church teachings emphasized modesty, but also procreation within marriage. Sex was seen as a duty and a means of continuing the family line, not an act requiring secrecy. In a world that offered none, menstruation was similarly public. Sanitary options were minimal. Cloth rags, often washed and reused, sometimes worn with a belt or girdle. These were cleaned in rivers or at communal wells, and drying them openly was routine. There is little historical evidence of shame or concealment. Around the process, it was an expected part of female life. This lack of privacy reveals something deeper about medieval mentalities. Shame and modesty were shaped by religion and social class, but not necessarily by space. Emotional boundaries existed, but physical ones did not. People were accustomed to coexistence. The modern idea that dignity requires separation simply didn't apply. Intimacy, by necessity, was communal. Even among the wealthy, privacy was limited. Castles featured shared halls and communal sleeping quarters. The concept of a private bedroom as a personal retreat only gained popularity in Europe, much later first among elites in the 15th and 16th centuries, then gradually spreading with the rise of individualism and changing architecture. In the medieval world, life was lived in the open not because privacy was devalued, but because the conditions of existence left little space for it. It was a culture shaped not by isolation, but by constant presence and by a profound tolerance for the mesensis of human life. The medieval one-room home offered shelter, but it also harbored a constant, invisible threat at the center of nearly every dwelling was the hearth. It served as the only source of heat, light, and cooking in the home. But these open fires burned day and night, releasing thick, acrid smoke into an enclosed space with almost no ventilation. Before the widespread introduction of chimneys in the late Middle Ages, typically the 14th or 15th century, smoke from the fire had nowhere to go. It filled the air, clung to walls, and settled in lungs. Small holes near the roofline or simple gaps in the thatch might allow some smoke to escape, but most of it lingered, turning the interior into a permanent haze of soot and fumes. The consequences were not abstract. Chronic respiratory issues were common. Coughing, wheezing, eye irritation, and long-term damage to the lungs were daily realities. Children, whose lungs were still developing, were especially vulnerable. And in winter, when fires burned continuously to combat freezing temperatures, smoke levels rose dangerously. There are records from later centuries of homes so small that residents had to lie close to the floor to breathe more easily, an issue that likely existed much earlier. Livestock added another layer of risk. Animals were brought indoors, not just for warmth, but also for security against theft or predators. Their waste accumulated rapidly, producing ammonia, fumes, and methane. Combined with smoke from the hearth, this cocktail of airborne pollutants created an environment modern scientists would classify as hazardous. Then there was the ever-present threat of fire. Thatched roofs, wooden beams, dry rushes on the floor all were highly flammable. An errant ember, a gust of wind, or a toppled pot could ignite an inferno within seconds. With no firefighting infrastructure, and neighbors living close together, a single house fire could destroy entire villages. Insurance did not exist. Rebuilding depended on the goodwill of neighbors or the permission of the local lord. And for families already living on the edge of survival, fire could mean homelessness, hunger, or death. These conditions shaped behavior. Cooking was typically done low and slow, with pots suspended over the fire or nestled in coals. Children were taught early to stay clear of flames. Some families built clay or stone surrounds for the hearth, not for efficiency, but as a buffer against catastrophe. Lifespans during the medieval period varied widely, but environmental hazards like smoke, inhalation, and indoor air pollution certainly played a role in limiting longevity among the peasantry. Combined with malnutrition, disease, and hard physical labor, the air inside a home could quietly shorten lives day after day. Yet for all its dangers, the hearth remained indispensable. It was not just a hazard, but a lifeline. It boiled water, baked bread, heated bodies, and lit the darkness. Families could not afford to abandon it. Instead, they learned to live with the risk. The one-room home was not a peaceful refuge. It was a place of tension, a space that offered safety from the outside world, while quietly undermining the health of those within. In the medieval home, there was no separation between the sacred and the mundane. Daily survival and spiritual devotion occupied the same confined space, often, quite literally, the same few square meters. Christianity was not just a part of life in medieval Europe, it was the foundation of it. From sunrise to sunset, the rhythm of daily activity was deeply influenced by the Church's teachings, feast days, and ritual expectations. Even in one-room dwellings, homes of dirt floors, soot-darkened beams, and thatched roofs, faith found its place. Without space for chapels or separate prayer rooms, families created sacred corners. These were modest. A wooden cross carved into a support beam, a painted icon hanging above the hearth, or a small alcove holding a Bible, if one could be afforded. In most cases, households did not own books. The presence of a holy object, a saint's figurine, a relic fragment, or a votive candle served as a physical and spiritual anchor. Prayers were said aloud, often led by the eldest member of the household. Morning, mealtime, and evening prayers became ritualized events, spoken not in grand churches, but in hushed voices around a shared fire. The hearth, the heart of domestic life, often became the symbolic altar. Its warmth, light, and permanence mirrored the presence of God in an otherwise volatile world. The church taught that every Christian home should be a little church. This idea, supported by both clergy and laity, emphasized the family's responsibility to observe religious customs even in private. The home became a place where feast days were marked, candles were lit for the dead, and children were taught catechism, often orally, by their parents. Holy days like Christmas, Easter, or the feast of a local patron saint brought special rituals into the home. Food would be blessed. Beds might be sprinkled with holy water. In some regions, protective charms inscribed with religious symbols were placed above doors or windows to ward off evil spirits or disease. These practices blended Orthodox Christian teachings with older folk customs, creating a uniquely domestic form of piety. But the sacred did not displace the realities of life. Worship happened alongside work. Prayer was offered in the same space where animals slept and children cried. The spiritual and the physical coexisted out of necessity, not contradiction. For medieval families, faith was not confined to churches. It was interwoven with the struggle to survive. In a world of uncertainty, the cramped home served as both refuge and sanctuary, and within its narrow walls, generations found ways to make room for the divine. Life in a one-room medieval home was not static, it shifted with the seasons, each bringing a new set of trials and a different rhythm of survival. For most peasant families, the structure they lived in, made of timber, mud, and thatch, offered little protection from nature's extremes. Instead, it forced them to adapt, physically and mentally, to every turn of the calendar. Winter was the harshest test. With no insulation and only an open hearth for heat, indoor temperatures could drop dangerously low. Families huddled together at night under layers of wool and straw. Livestock were sometimes brought indoors, not just for their protection, but for the body heat they generated. Smoke from the fire lingered in the air, as chimneys were uncommon. The air was thick and acrid, but the hearth was life. Its flames offered the only barrier between survival and freezing death. Spring thawed the land, but brought new problems. The thatched roof often leaked, the packed earth floors turned to mud, and vermin multiplied. Insects, especially fleas and lice, were constant companions, and spring rains brought them in waves. Children often went barefoot, their feet caked in the damp soil of a home that was, essentially, built into the landscape itself. Summer added heat, filth, and flies. The absence of sanitation, combined with close quarters, meant that odors and disease spread easily. But it also brought longer days critical for work in the fields and the anticipation of harvest. Homes were emptier during daylight, as families labored outdoors. In the evenings, they returned to the cramped room, sunburnt and exhausted, to eat, rest, and plan the next day's labor. Yet amid this hardship, there was joy because there had to be. Feast days, often tied to the church calendar, broke the monotony of labor. Christmas, Easter, the feast of the local patron saint. These were occasions for community gatherings, song, and shared meals. Even in the tight confines of the home, families found space to laugh, sing, and tell stories. Oral storytelling was both entertainment and education, a way to pass on values, history, and humor when books were rare and literacy rarer still. Music was simple pipes, drums, or clapping hands, but meaningful. Dances, even in crowded homes, were performed in celebration of births, marriages, and bountiful harvests. Bread, ale, and salted meat were shared, and for a moment, the burdens of survival gave way to human connection. In the medieval world, suffering was constant, but so was resilience. And in that single, smoky, dirt-floored room, people carved out moments of warmth built, not with bricks, but with kinship, ritual, and the enduring will to endure. In the medieval one-room home, childhood was not a separate stage of life, was an extension of labor, of survival, and of shared existence. A child's first breath was taken in the same space where food was cooked, animals were kept, and family life unfolded. There was no nursery, no privacy, no distinction between day and night when a birth occurred. It happened where everything else happened, than the packed dirt floor beside the hearth, surrounded by siblings and elders. Infant mortality was staggering. In some parts of Europe between the 12th and 14th centuries, estimates suggest that as many as 30 to 50% of children died before the age of 5. Illnesses spread easily in the cramped, smoky air of the home. A simple fever, infection, or contaminated water source could claim a young life in days. Parents mourned, but they also braced themselves. Death was a constant presence, especially among the smallest and most vulnerable. For those who survived infancy, childhood was brief. By the age of 5 or 6, many children were already engaged in meaningful work. In a peasant household, this meant tending animals, fetching water, collecting firewood, or watching over even younger siblings. The dirt floor became a classroom, not for reading and writing, but for learning survival, how to knead dough, mend a fence, or tell when the soil was ready for planting. Education came through imitation, observation, and oral tradition. Formal schooling was rare, and mostly reserved for boys of wealthier families or those destined for the church. In rural homes, literacy was almost non-existent, but children weren't unlearned. They knew seasonal rhythms, religious rituals, and the unwritten codes of community life. They memorized prayers, hymns, and the rules of feast days. They learned through participation, not instruction. Still, despite the hardship, there was play. Archaeological evidence from medieval villages reveals simple toys-whittled wooden dolls, animal bones turned into game pieces, and crude balls, made of cloth or pig bladders. Children played with each other in doorways, fields, or sometimes indoors when space allowed. Songs, clapping games, and storytelling pastime and strengthened bonds. Lullabies were sung, often layered with warnings or religious overtones, designed as much to teach as to soothe. Sibling relationships were intense. They shared not only a bed or blanket, but every stage of life. A child might sleep with an infant, brother one night, and bury him the next week. The emotional maturity demanded by this cycle was steepened early, and yet tenderness persisted. Shared chores became moments of cooperation. Caregiving was expected of older children, especially girls, long before adolescence. To grow up on a medieval dirt floor was to be both innocent and burdened. There were no locked doors, no toys scattered across separate bedrooms, no quiet corners to retreat to. Childhood was lived fully in the open with an arm's reach of fire, family, livestock, and labor. It was shaped not by choice, but by necessity. And in that necessity, generations learned to endure, to adapt, and to find fragments of joy in a world that asked so much of them, so early. By the late 14th century, the shape of home life in Europe began to shift, slowly, unevenly, and first among those with means. The one-room dwelling, once the standard of domestic existence, gave way to a new kind of house. It was called the hall and parlor design, and it marked the beginning of a fundamental change in how people lived, worked, and thought about space. In this evolving layout, the single communal room was divided. The open hearth still dominated one side the hall, but now a second room emerged, the parlor. It served multiple purposes: a private sleeping area, a storage space, or a more formal setting for guests. This structural division reflected a deeper societal transformation, the rise of individuality within the household. The architectural change was not just a matter of comfort. It mirrored larger currents in late medieval Europe. As trade networks expanded and local economies grew, wealth slowly concentrated in the hands of more prosperous yeoman farmers and urban artisans. This allowed some families to build larger homes with timber framing and wattle and daub walls, separating spaces by function rather than necessity. By the 15th century, the shift became more visible in regions like England, France, and parts of the Low Countries. In towns and growing cities, stone and brick construction enabled multi-storied homes with upper rooms reserved for sleep, storage, or business. Glass windows, still rare and expensive, began to appear in the homes of merchants and guild leaders. Chimneys replaced the central hearth in wealthier buildings, allowing for enclosed, smoke-free rooms and even heated upper floors. This spatial reorganization coincided with intellectual movements that would later be known as the Renaissance. Humanism, with its emphasis on the individual, subtly shaped how people thought about personal space. Privacy, once unthinkable in the one-room model, began to gain value, not yet a right, but a luxury. Separate bedrooms allowed for modesty. Locked chests and separate parlors provided control over possessions and conversations. Urbanization accelerated the trend. In cities like Florence, Bruges, and London, land scarcity forced vertical growth. Homes became layered, with shops on the ground floor, family quarters above, and servants' rooms in the attic. Domestic life began to stratify not only by class, but by floor. Still, the transition was gradual. In much of rural Europe, the one-room home remained dominant well into the 17th century. Change came faster in towns, among the prosperous, and where cultural and economic revolutions took root earliest. But the seeds were planted. With each partitioned wall and separate doorway, the medieval world edged towards something new, a home. No longer defined solely by survival, but by structure, status, and identity. From one room to many, the house became a reflection not just of a family's needs, but of a society learning to imagine life differently. Modern homes are quiet. Behind locked doors and insulated walls, the sounds of daily life are muffled. Family member retreating to their own room, their own screen, their own world. Privacy is now seen as a necessity, but this is a recent development. For most of human history, it was a rarity. In medieval Europe, homes were small, crowded, and communal. A single-room dwelling was not an exception, it was the norm. Families cooked, slept, prayed, birthed, and died within arm's reach of one another. Intimacy was not chosen, it was structural. Children watched their siblings be born. Grandparents passed away within view of the hearth. Bodily functions, emotional outbursts, and daily chores unfolded in plain sight. Privacy as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. Even among the wealthier classes, rooms were often shared, and servants frequently slept near or within the same quarters as their employers. Curtains, not doors, furred what little separation there was. Ideas of modesty, shame, or secrecy evolved under very different conditions. Life was observed, known, intertwined, but in that closeness was a constant awareness of others. In small villages, neighbors leaned on each other, not just socially, but physically. Tools were borrowed, bread was shared, illness was tended communally. Emotional resilience was reinforced not by solitude, but by proximity, by hearing the laughter and grief of others, by seeing the rhythms of life and death play out together. The architectural shift toward multi-room homes began gradually in the late Middle Ages, as economic growth allowed for more individualized space. By the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in urban centers, middle-class homes often had parlors, studies, and separate bedrooms. The Industrial Revolution accelerated this trend. Increased wealth, urban planning, and new values around cleanliness, productivity, and self-discipline reinforced the belief that a proper home was a compartmentalized one. By the 20th century, privacy was no longer a luxury. It was an expectation. Children had their own rooms. Doors had locks. Entire lives could be lived in self-contained silence. The nuclear family replaced the multi-generational household. Neighbors, once daily presences, became distant figures. This evolution brought comfort, security, and autonomy, but at a cost. Loneliness, unknown in the communal past, became a modern epidemic. Elderly relatives often lived and died alone. Mental health struggles became harder to detect. Children grew up surrounded by walls instead of extended kin. Community, once forged by necessity, became optional and often absent. None of this is to romanticize hardship. Medieval families lived in poverty, exposed to disease, with little reprieve from the demands of survival. Their lives were short and often brutal, but they were rarely lived alone. The past cannot be resurrected, nor should it be. But understanding what was lost when privacy was gained reveals the fragile trade-offs of progress. We moved from one room to many, from togetherness to autonomy, from the known to the private, and in the silence of modern life. It's worth asking, what kind of connection did we trade away when we finally found a room of our own?